What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This week is episode 30. We're doing my fifth of the Dark Tower reviews. We're just cruising right through these. We're covering not book 5, but book 4.5 of the series Wind Through the Keyhole. This was a rather short one, not quite as short as The Gunslinger, but still pretty small, especially after the chonker that was Wizard and Glass. The actual reading process for me when I read it in early May, because I burned myself out a little bit reading so darn much in April, was rather slow. Just reading this book took probably like 5 days longer than I think it should have, but even so, I enjoyed this book quite a bit. I don't really have much else to say in the intro to this video, so let's just kind of talk into how I felt about the book, because I think I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected, and a lot more than most other people, I think, did, based on common talking points that I've heard. So let's start with some of the best elements of not Wizard and Glass, that's not what we're covering. Wind Through the Keyhole. What are some of the best elements of Wind Through the Keyhole? Looking at my notes right now, it appears that I kind of forgot to clarify a couple of the points that I'm making at the very beginning of the section that I don't remember for sure what I was trying to say, so I'm just kind of gonna go a little bit more freeform for a couple of these points. The first thing that I loved about Wizard and Glass was that it has very story time feel that I really enjoyed. Now, of course, this is because, similar to Wizard and Glass, a lot of this book is a flashback, but not just that. There's also a section of the book where within the flashback, Roland's young character, because it is another flashback for Roland, spoilers, but also kind of not, within that flashback, Roland tells a story to another character. So there's kind of a story within a story within a story type of thing happening in part of this book. Particularly in that innermost story of the spectrum, so I'm not saying the same thing over and over, there is the story, I think, is technically a bedtime story of sorts within the world that King created within Midworld, and because of that, there is that kind of bedtime story feel in the book. I really enjoyed that, but even just Roland, telling of his past is kind of a story time type of feel. I even had that feeling a little bit in Wizard of Glass, because 85% of that book was, the flashback. And speaking of which, you get more young Roland in this book. That's something else that I really enjoyed. Roland is probably my favorite character in the series overall. I know a lot of people really like Eddie, and I do as well, but overall I think Roland is my favorite. I just connect to him so much, especially after Wizard and Glass with the flashback. I don't necessarily relate to his character a whole lot, but there's a lot of things that I do connect to. I love Roland, so it worked for me to get more of this. Another good thing that I felt existed within Wind Through the Keyhole was that there are some elements, because, at the time of recording, I have read up through Song of Susanna. There are some elements that were introduced in Wolves of the Kala that this book actually used retroactively, since King wrote this several years after he finished the main series, that kind of prepared me for this book did kind of prepare me in a way for Wolves of the Kala. There was a little bit less of a learning curve in that future book. Now, that's not to say that there's anything super complex or anything like that happening in Wolves of the Kala, but there were a couple things that exist within that story, and I guess in the series as a whole, because King really knew what he was doing by the time he got to book 5, or by the time that he decided to write book 5, rather, that made it so that when he wrote this book retroactively a few years later, as just kind of an entry there in the middle, he used a couple of those elements. So the fact that I read this book prepared me for those things existing within the series, and I really liked that. I won't go into too much because sort of spoilers, but the term Directive 19, or something similar, will mean a lot to you after you read this book and Wolves of the Kala. There are certain events and characters associated with it that I felt were done despite the brevity of the book. And like I said, there's something about that additionally prepares for similar things, not necessarily exactly the same things, but similar things to come in Wolves of the Kala, kind of a foreshadowing type of thing that occurred after the fact. Within the original story, within the story of this book, just Roland telling of the initial flashback, it's called The Skin Man. It's split into two parts because it's split in the middle by the innermost story, I guess. Kind of hard to explain a little bit, but these flashback sections are called the Skin Man. There's some really great horror elements that Dark Tower has thus far been mostly devoid of that this section used, and I absolutely loved it. There was a little bit of mystery and investigation as well going on here that I thought was rather satisfying too. It was kind of cool to see that, especially as by the time this book was written, King was kind of shifting focus a little bit more to do a few more thriller or crime novels, stuff like that. So to see these horror elements that Dark Tower hadn't used up to the point in the series introduced into the series a little bit more fully, I think, in this book, as well as King introducing some of his other writing knowledge, some other things that he had been doing. He used some of that in the book in a way that I thought was really cool too. It was nice to see just this kind of amalgamation of the weirdness that is Dark Tower with everything else that he does well. And then also the main timeline things, I guess we can say, that happens in the book titled The Stark Blast, and then whatever happens at the very end, I forget what that section's called, introduces what the Stark Blast actually is. It was pretty abrupt in a way, kind of a strange element to introduce, because there had never been a Stark Blast or anything like that mentioned within the series before, and even up through Song of Susanna, it hasn't been mentioned before either. So I think King was just trying to put in a fun little extra thing into the series to make the book a little bit different than the rest. But it wasn't just like a gimmick for the sake of having an excuse to write another flashback. The Stark Blast also existed within the story, and within the story, within the story, within the story. Word vomit. Yeah, like I said, the through lines that he uses with this new element, despite how abrupt it feels at first, was really good. There were super cool things that happened as a result of it, including in the very end, too. Like, just the way that it all worked out is cool. I don't understand how King is able to write these books, quite frankly, without outlines. I don't know how much uh, of the editing process he goes through, like how many different drafts of books he goes through, but I can't imagine it's a small amount because without having to outline all of this stuff and knowing exactly all of these crazy things that are just gonna kind of come back to him in the end, he's just a professional at coming back to that foreshadowing and stuff like that despite the fact that he doesn't work with an outline. It's really crazy to me. And also the finale of the title story, because the bedtime story type of thing that Roland tells within the flashback is titled Wind Through the Keyhole. So the finale of the title story within that is also really cool because it paid off perfectly and also goes into some elements that come up later in the series. There's some very important kind of foreshadowing things, connections, hints towards future installments that I felt were really worth it to me. But now let's talk about some of the worst parts of The Wind Through the Keyhole. If you didn't enjoy Wizard and Glass and thought it was a bit much or a bit pretentious or even overindulgent in terms of, how much flashback it has, this can be a little bit hard to swallow because it's basically that same thing, except a little bit more ham-fisted in due to the fact that King wrote it after the whole series was finished and just had to find a place for it to fit. But on that same note, or rather the opposite side of the same coin, if you did enjoy Wizard and Glass but are anxious to return to the main story, I guess, you should push this off to reading at the very end of the series, like many people recommend. Wolves of the Kala, as the fifth book in the series, is rather side questy. It doesn't do as much with the main story thread that some people wanted it to do, but it's not nearly so much as Wizard and Glass, and this is. So if you do want to go on with the main story, Wolves of the Kala is already kind of parallel to that enough to make it a little bit hard to get into. So if you really are wanting to push forward with the series, I suggest pushing this one off for now, but if you don't really care or are interested in more flashback and some of these foreshadowy elements, quite frankly, as I like to think of them, you can read this in between books 4 and 5. Well, it's what I did, and I would say that I'm really glad that I did so. It does feel a little bit self-indulgent since this story is yet another one of these, tales within the tales and all that. After Wizard and Glass, it is self-indulgent, quite frankly, but I didn't mind this, and if you don't really care one way or the other, it's a great place to read it in between books 4 and 5. But there are going to be some who take issue with that, as always. And then, of course, since I've kind of mentioned this a couple times up to this point, the fact that it was written retroactively means that the beginning and the end of the book don't necessarily feel the smoothest in the way that they fit in the overall series because of that. Not necessarily a huge problem, but these things felt to me like they were just kind of serviceable. They were just kind of an excuse to fit it in between, what happens at the end of book 4, Wizard and Glass with the Emerald Palace, and then the goal of Thunderclap for Wolves of the Kala, but they don't tie into the main timeline super well. Obviously, it wasn't part of that initial arc that was being created, so it feels like it was just kind of inserted because it could be. Not necessarily a huge problem, but it does feel a little bit janky because of that. Overall, generally speaking, these things, at least the way that I interpret them, are minor gripes at best, so there's not that much to complain about in the book. I enjoyed Wind Through the Keyhole a heck of a lot more than I expected to based on what I had heard about it. I had heard that it was mediocre at best, or just serviceable, but it turned out being quite good to me. I enjoyed it quite a lot. It's absolutely, obviously, not a necessity for the series overall, but I'm glad I read it and found it very worthwhile. It might still be my least favorite in the series, though I'd have to think about that now that I read Song of Susanna. There are some major problems with that. Might not be my least favorite anymore, but we'll see. But it is still a very good book. Anyways, I think at this point it's time to end the video. It's a rather short book. I don't need to talk for very much longer than this, but I will be back again next week with a review on Wolves of the Kala, going right into the next Dark Tower review. Expect Song of Susanna and Dark Tower finale, last book of the series reviews in September. So, anyways, that's all for this week. Check out seasonalproductions.com for all of my writing and video content all in one place. I'll be back again in next week's episode of the Book Binge.